our study series on jihadist terrorism in Europe, you took a close look on the threat level in Belgium, a European country that has been hit particularly hard by terrorism. I'm thinking here especially of the attack in 2016 in Brussels. How has the threat level developed since then, and also since the military defeat of the Islamic State?
Compared to what we've seen from 2014 until 2017, things seem to have calmed down in Belgium. In our study, we listed all the incidents since the fall of the so-called Islamic State in Syria in 2017. And there was only one lethal attack resulting in 3 deaths. And that's now more than 3 years ago. But that does not mean that there's no reason for concern anymore. The foremost reason for concern, I think, is that the number of potential terrorists remains very high. We still have more than 600 people on the official list of potential terrorists, counting only jihadists. And it is always very difficult to compare between countries because of other definitions, other criteria. But I think it's very worrisome that the number of people on that list in Belgium is the same, more or less, as in Germany, while Germany has 7 times more people. There's also a dangerous evolution in the profile of the perpetrators of attacks in Belgium and in other European countries. They become younger. They become more diverse in ethnical backgrounds, and they become less visible, integrated in networks. And all of that makes them harder to detect, harder to stop their actions. And crucially, most of them are not the foreign terrorist fighters who returned from Syria, as we once feared, but people who never managed to get there, raising the suspicion that frustration exactly about that can be a major driver to push them to violence at home. And last but not least, the polarization to which the recent wave of jihadism has attributed, also in Belgium, is still very, very high. We are at a point that radicalization on the other end of the spectrum, the far-right extremism, has become as dangerous almost as the jihadist one. Looking for Belgium at the degree of popular support that a far-right Belgian soldier got when he departed recently on a mission to commit an attack, I'm afraid that we haven't seen the end of that polarization yet.
What is the Belgian government's strategy in fighting terrorism, both with soft power and hard power methods, and how do you assess that strategy?
In this study, we have only looked into what you call hard power, the effort of security services to tackle jihadist violence and the effort of the judiciary to keep the country safe. That is not to say that hard power is the most important. Absolutely not. Especially in the long term, prevention of radicalization and disengagement of people already radicalized is crucial, of course. But to assess the efforts in that field in Belgium, where responsibilities and policy are spread over several different levels, would take a study in itself, I'm afraid. And the most important questions in terms of being successful aren't unique for Belgium. That being said, I think that Belgium did a good job in terms of its legal framework. We have fairly adequate laws to address all kinds of terrorist threats for many years already. And the gaps that emerged during the Syrian war were quickly closed. For example, people could be prosecuted for mere membership of a terrorist organization in Belgium before the Syrian war already, in contrast with several other European countries. And things like traveling to a conflict zone with terrorist intentions or recruiting for that travel were added as soon as the need became apparent. In terms of investigative work, Belgian security services were early on the job. Of course, there is a lot that they have not been able to counter, especially the French-Belgian terrorist cell that was behind the Paris and Brussels attacks. But that kind of failures, we know it now from almost every country. And I think that for a country with limited resources like Belgium, lots of good work has been done too. The weakest link, in my opinion, in the Belgian response to terrorism are the courts. They are often too lenient in their sentencing, partly due to a lack of competent judges. While the average sentence for a terrorist offense is 7 years now in the European Union, in Belgium it's only 5. And at the same time, there have been cases too in my country in which a suspect was punished too harsh, simply because procedures were rushed without looking into all the details, without looking into mitigating circumstances. So I think it's fair to say that Belgian courts do underperform regarding terrorism.
Thank you so much for talking to us today and summarizing a couple of points from the study.
All right, thanks.
We look forward to talking to other experts about what's happening in Belgium and in Europe. What does the Belgian jihadist scene look like, also in the context of a European network? And also, in what ways is the Belgian scene maybe different than the others in Europe?
The Belgian jihadist scene is a bit special in a way that it was basically the biggest group of foreign fighters per capita in every single European country that has left. In Belgium, we had three main networks of foreign fighters. Sharia for Belgium, which basically, after it disbanded itself, most of its members left for Syria. Then we had a sister group, Resto du Tawhid, operating in Brussels and Vlierden. And last but not least, the Zerkani network, which consisted of all the guys who committed the attacks in Europe. At first, the guys from the Zerkani network joined a Libyan national branch of the Islamic State called Katibat al-Batar al-Libya, but they ended up fighting in the security apparatus of the Islamic State and started preparing for the attacks in Europe. The very first of it being the attack on the Jewish Museum in Brussels by Mehdi Nemouche, later on a foiled attempt in Verviers, and then eventually the attacks in Paris, and later on, eventually in Brussels. The guys from the Zerkani network were the ones responsible for all these attacks. They were the operators behind it.
Do you see any big significant differences between the Belgian jihadist scene and others in Europe?
Well, in Eastern Europe, for example, we have a lot of foreign fighters from Chechen origin. We had those in Belgium as well, but very small branches. Only in the east part of the country, we had some Chechens operating. Most of the guys who left here from Belgium had a Moroccan or a North African background, actually. It was a common process everybody went through. Basically, as the Islamic State also always pointed out, everybody is equal in the Islamic State. So the preparations were often conducted by people in, for example, London, who then came over to Brussels, who recruited some of the guys or picked them up, then left with them together to Turkey, where they had all the processes in place for false passports and then eventually transportation to Syria or Iraq. That's not so much different from how it basically went in other European countries. It's, as I said, it's a common process.
What role does the war in Syria play in creating the Belgian terrorism threat? During the peak of the Islamic State's influence, Belgium became known as the European country with the highest per capita contingent of foreign fighters. So how does that affect the country today?
Well, if it weren't for the Syria war, we wouldn't have any foreign fighters, in my idea. We would have had some lone actors, possibly, but it's easy to say that the war in Syria was the catalyst for the leaving of the Belgian foreign fighters. Actually, even before the war already started, there were some Belgians active in Lebanon, and they were trying to build up a network for al-Qaida in preparation of what they thought was going to happen during the so-called Arab Spring. So they were well prepared at some point. And then eventually when it started, they as I said before, they left en masse. Hundreds of them left or tried to leave Belgium.
And do you think this has an effect? For example, that people who would have been fighting in Syria usually will now try to go to Afghanistan. Do you think that the theaters of jihadism will change in a way?
The theaters of the Islamic State's jihadism have already changed in a bit. They're still mainly operative in Iraq and Syria, but they have no physical territory left. Right now, the biggest drive of the Islamic State, if you want to put it like that, would be indeed in Afghanistan, but especially in Africa. At this point, We don't know of any Belgian fighters who tried to leave for those theaters of war, Africa or Afghanistan. But it's possible it might happen at some point. There already have been rumors in the past that some of the defeated ISIS members from Iraq and Syria ran off to Afghanistan. In how much that's true, we don't really know. But at this point, for example, the Belgian contingent of foreign fighters, we still have around 150 people unaccounted for. We don't know where they are, if they're dead, if they are locked up in some prison, or if they are still operating somewhere in the desert. We have no idea.
Ein Angebot der Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung.